This documentary includes propaganda films made in the 1940s by the United States and others to galvanize support for World War II.
The details are not available. Diplomats from Tokyo. The president is now giving out a statement. Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was deliberately attacked by the Empire of Japan.
What do you think we ought to do to them? Well, the Japanese people are to blame for this.
The Germans and the Japanese. There's no place for either in the world today.
No matter how long it may take us, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
We must have more ships, more guns, more planes, more of everything.
We must be the great arsenal of democracy. We will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
World War II was total war, as much industrial as military, pitting the massive manufacturing might of the United States against the Axis powers: Germany, Japan, and Italy. While not immediately apparent to our enemies, the U.S. had three distinct advantages. Its location was far from the battlefield. There were plentiful natural resources, and there was a huge, diverse workforce, positioning the U.S. for victory. Re-elected to his second term, 32nd President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had been calling on Americans to prepare for war well before the Japanese attack.
We must be the great arsenal of democracy. There will be no bottlenecks in our determination to aid Great Britain.
Just before the U.S. entered the war, Roosevelt signed the Lend-Lease Act, guaranteeing the production of war materiel to support our allies. Companies making cars, toys, and appliances would start producing guns, planes, and tanks. Coastal cities shouldered much of the burden, but Midwestern cities like Detroit and especially Chicago were of vital importance too.
Chicago was a great manufacturing city. We had a great location, we had a great workforce, we had a lot to offer.
With nearly 3.5 million residents, the city has become the second largest center of population in the Western Hemisphere. The Union stockyards are the largest in the world. Although Chicago today is the world's greatest railroad center, that fact does not diminish its importance as a freshwater port.
Between 1937 and 1941, debate raged, particularly in Chicago, over whether America should become more involved in the European war. Led by Chicago Tribune publisher Robert McCormick, a Republican, the America First isolationists wanted to stay neutral. But interventionists, like Chicago Sun publisher Marshall Field III and Frank Knox, Chicago Daily News publisher, wanted the U.S. to get involved. So did the city's Irish Catholic mayor, Ed Kelly.
Constantly on the alert.
Kelly, classic old school political figure, the master politician, the guy who knows how things work, all things through patronage and contacts and networks.
Kelly was one of the most powerful mayors in the country at the time and made sure that supporters of the democratic machine were definitely taken care of.
President Roosevelt, a big Kelly supporter, visited Chicago in 1937 to open a newly completed bridge on Lakeshore Drive.
They expected Roosevelt to come in and just, hooray for Chicago. And in the end, it became a cautionary warning about fascism and preparing us for war, which eventually came.
The present reign of terror and international lawlessness began a few years ago. Let no one imagine that America will not be attacked. Without a declaration of war, vast numbers of women and children are being ruthlessly murdered with bombs from the air.
Roosevelt's re-election promise was not to entangle the country in another war unless we were attacked. His new Chicago message was alarming, and he'd need help from powerful allies like Mayor Ed Kelly to sell it.
They were very close friends, but very different. It's a very interesting dynamic between the two. Roosevelt often asked him questions about political things, but also personal things too.
Kelly would help Roosevelt keep the drumbeat of intervention going strong, even organizing civilian defense before the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Mayor Kelly, recognizing Chicago's responsibility for the survival of the civilized world, meets with his Civilian Defense Committee.
This commission was organized more than a year ago. The time for action has come.
After Pearl Harbor, interventionists had no problem encouraging millions of eager young men and women to enlist. But persuading the civilian population to commit to a potentially lengthy world war would require the use of government-produced propaganda.
If you are Japanese, you believe you have been destined to rule the earth and all who live on it.
The German people, fond of tyranny, of aggression, fond of gas chambers.
People were obviously fed a lot of propaganda, but most of it was thought to be believable. And also, there's a tendency during wartime to make the enemy into the other, someone who is not entirely human.
There was some great visual imagery, some great visual propaganda that not only told you what you should do, but also told you what you should not do, and that's talk a lot.
Propaganda was used heavily and pervaded all forms of pop culture.
The U.S. Navy's dive bombers, the super pilots who fly America's super planes.
Relying on their fears and their patriotism, government propaganda targeted all civilians to get them emotionally involved in the war, to prepare them for personal sacrifice, and motivate them to work hard for victory. Getting Chicago's black community involved in the war effort was definitely Mayor Kelly's goal, but he had another agenda. By using the offer of wartime jobs and the promise of political power, he hoped to solicit allegiance to his democratic machine.
Kelly enlists the Roosevelt administration in the form of jobs and programs to get African Americans moving from the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln to the Democratic Party of Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Kelly was smart enough to grasp that there was an opportunity to make Chicago a permanent Democratic majority city.
Black voters did strengthen Kelly's grip on the city, but would the wartime jobs he promised really benefit them?
For African Americans, access to jobs afforded an opportunity to try to transform the conditions of inequality, the conditions of discrimination that existed for them.
And to help combat discrimination, Roosevelt did issue an executive order making segregation in defense plants illegal.
Unfortunately, from the industry's point of view, only certain people were appropriate for certain jobs. So during the Second World War, African American status was second class at best.
In spite of the inequality, Chicago's black community, numbering over 300,000, enlisted in the military or worked and sacrificed on the home front. All of Chicago's communities supported the war effort, including Eastern Europeans, like Chicago's huge Polish population, and for good reason.
On September 1st, 1939, the Nazi army invaded Poland and World War II officially began. For almost 2 years, the struggle would be going on in Poland without American intervention. So the Polish ethnic community in Chicago feels that its homeland has been under attack, and it's trying to raise money for Polish war relief. Also, you have to understand that in 1939, Chicago was the third largest Jewish community in the world, outside of New York and Warsaw. And about, I'd say, 75% of those Jews were Polish Jews.
And Chicago's Jewish community had been sounding the alarm about the Nazis since the early 1930s.
Of the approximately 300,000 Jews here in Chicago, the overwhelming majority had family in Europe that they had left behind. And when the Nazis rose to power, they were forced to emigrate and give up everything they had to the Third Reich in order to survive. So they were very much aware about what was going on in Europe in terms of anti-Semitism and of the Holocaust. So the Jewish community were all actively involved in the war effort.
Chicago's Greek community also had a stake in the war. Greece had been under siege since 1940 by both Nazis and fascists.
When I was about 13 or 14, I saw Erich Marie Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front. I came out so shaken, resolved that I would never fight in any war, that wars were all senseless. But by the time of Pearl Harbor and the revelations about what the Nazis were doing, suddenly I was ready for war. Time came for my induction. I was in good physical shape. I could not conceive of not being accepted. So I went through the whole series of tests, then followed a group of people into one room where some man behind a desk stamped a big 4F on my application. I was stunned.
Scars on his lungs, the result of childhood tuberculosis, kept Petrakis from military service. The future writer spent most of the war observing everything.
You'd see boys who'd go to war, and then you'd see them come home on leave. And they'd say to us, "Your turn will come, wait, your turn will come." It was as if a great drama was being enacted, and I was on the sidelines.
Chicago's loyal German community spent the war struggling to distance themselves from Nazi sympathizers.
The German community, they were very concerned about not being identified with the German-American Bund. There were a couple thousand members in Chicago. They actually wore swastikas. Their leader modeled himself kind of as Hitler. He would run around the same type of costume.
There were battles between followers of the Bund and Jewish toughs that when they saw people who were not sensitive enough to Jewish needs, they engaged in fisticuffs.
It didn't get any easier for Germans or Italians or Japanese either. When President Roosevelt issued proclamations labeling immigrants over 14 years of age who were not naturalized citizens as enemy aliens, subject to arrest and/or imprisonment.
There were individual cases of young men who were arrested arbitrarily, who had no connection to the acts of sabotage that were so greatly feared. One that comes to mind, of course, is the famous case of Eberhard Fuhrer.
I was born in Germany in 1925, and my parents brought me here to the United States in 1928. I was in high school in my senior year, and then the principal came in and said, Eberhard, I've got to ask you to step in the hallway. 2 FBI agents, they put handcuffs on me.
Führer's parents had been arrested the previous year. Now they had him, and older brother Julius was next.
So they picked him up too. They took us to the police headquarters and charged us with suspicion. And the guards said, what are we going to do with these Nazis? I was literally frightened to death that night. And in the morning, they put us in a car and we went to 4800 South Ellis Avenue in Chicago.
You had this old mansion converted basically into a little POW center. Not really a POW, but enemy alien detention center.
There was a wrought iron fence around it, and there were guards on the outside. The population was almost exclusively German, except for 2 or 3 Italians. We were told you must pull the shades so nobody can shoot you. And apparently there had been some drive-by shootings.
Eberhard was eventually reunited with his family in a Texas prison camp, but not released until 1947. The South Ellis facility wasn't the only Chicagoland detention center. One of the largest was just north of the city.
Fort Sheridan during World War II was the administrative center for the German, Japanese, Italian prisoners of war, 4,000 of whom were at the Fort Sheridan site itself.
Every day, enemy prisoners would be transported in and out of the fort, drawing the attention of curious locals, especially children.
We would stand there gawking at these German prisoners, all very happy and waving to us, and we would wave back, and that was a big thing for us. Then they started to bring the Japanese prisoners, and we didn't wave to them. We had heard that they ate kids, and we didn't want to get eaten.
A number of these smaller kind of subcamps existed in the Chicagoland area. Camp Skokie Valley in Glenview, one in Thornton on the south side of Chicago, Camp Pine in Des Plaines. Camp Grant near Rockford was the biggest one.
With camps located in the middle of the country, escapees had little chance of returning home. But trained spies and saboteurs were a more dangerous threat.
The most notable saboteur was Hans Haupt. Born in Germany, he immigrated to Chicago with his parents, and he spoke English without a trace of a German accent. He was a member of the Lane High School ROTC, and it was recalled how much he loved wearing that uniform. He would strut around the house in that uniform.
Ultimately, Haupt returned to Germany to enroll in the Abwehr, the German spy school, where he and his small group were trained to sabotage railway lines, essential wartime factories, and if possible, steal secrets.
Hans Haupt was 21 years old when he landed back in America by German submarining and was captured by the FBI.
Haupt was executed along with 5 other saboteurs. And it should be noted, there was very little sabotage here.
Negative feelings toward Chicago's Italian community had more to do with their history of organized crime than with the actions of buffoonish dictator Benito Mussolini. And the Roosevelt administration didn't feel Italians posed a significant threat. They felt differently about the Japanese.
The time, 1942. More than 100,000 men, women, and children, all of Japanese ancestry, removed from their homes in the Pacific Coast states to wartime communities established in out-of-the-way places. Relocation did not imply individual disloyalty, but was ordered when danger of invasion was great.
My name is Jean Mishima. You can just call me Jean. I was born in California. We were interned together in Gila River, Arizona. My parents lost everything. Our identification number was 43055, and I was 43055C. The camps were built like army barracks. There was absolutely no privacy. I don't think I realized what was really happening.
Over time, after intensive screening, Jean's family and thousands of others were relocated again, this time further inland to Chicago, where the pre-war Japanese community had numbered about 400. Now, with these new arrivals, the population increased by 20,000.
There were difficulties in finding housing. There were certainly issues related to employment. There was a glass ceiling in place.
Probably Ruth Nishi never thought she'd be a crack turret lathe operator in Chicago when she was working around Berkeley, California.
There was a lot of underlying and overt discrimination against the Japanese, but still, we found an apartment at 55th and Blackstone, the buffer zone between the whites and the blacks. My mother found a job in a factory doing piecework. My father lost his self-respect and self-worth. He started drinking and gambling. I think that the internment experience affected each generation differently.
The reality is that the grand majority of the Japanese American population in the U.S. was very loyal.
With the enemy alien population identified and presumably under control, the federal government turned its full attention to war production, and so did Chicago.
This city realized that everybody had to get in this fight and that it was everybody's job to support the war effort. We didn't know we were going to be able to win this war.
Roosevelt's War Production Board had been tasked with overseeing the conversion of industry from peacetime work to wartime work. These new jobs would end nagging unemployment caused by the Great Depression, and struggling companies would suddenly have cash to retool. But where would the government get the cash? Just like today, the Fed printed more money and raised taxes. But even that wouldn't be enough.
So one of the ways the federal government raised money to fund the war was by holding war bond drives where they would go to the public and ask for contributions.
In Chicago, Illinois, the crowds stand in the warm Midwestern sun as our soldiers and our sailors go marching past. Down Michigan Boulevard in the bright sun, and the crowds cheer them. War bonds. This is our part of the fight. This is what we buy. The terrible cost of war sustained through war bonds. More tanks, more planes, more ships for our country.
There were many billion-dollar bond drives. In Chicago, the 6th war bond drive was headquartered at Navy Pier. They had a huge indoor display area filled with exhibits. And outside, they had fighter planes, anti-aircraft gunnery exhibitions, and military landing craft that people could board. This was all designed to instill patriotic fervor and to show civilians how their money was being spent.
With bond drives footing the bill, it was time for those who couldn't fight to work hard in over 1,400 Chicago area companies producing everything from tanks to planes.
They're building monster transport planes for war service at the new Douglas C-54 plant in Orchard Place, just northwest of Chicago. The 2 million square foot factory will be turning out planes at a high rate of speed. First off the production line, the Chicago Skymaster.
They produced 655 of the C-54 transports there. They had a parking lot for 6,300 automobiles.
It was where Chicago's O'Hare Airport stands today, and was said to be the largest wooden building in the world at the time.
Because they didn't want to use steel that could be used for ships and planes and tanks, etc.
The total number of workers was about 15,000, and it included 3 dwarves, because they were very good in tight places. They were riveters, and they could get into the fuel tanks.
A lot of women worked at that plant. Many of them had husbands, sweethearts, or sons in the war, and they wanted to do their part.
I have a daughter in the waves, and I had a son on the Arizona.
That's a good enough reason for anyone. My husband's a prisoner of the Japs in the Philippines. If he'd had a few more of these shells out in Bataan, maybe he'd still be fighting.
Offensive by today's standards, propaganda films designed to attract women to the wartime workforce were typically written by men.
Millions and millions of women who had never lifted a finger outside their own homes now suddenly resolved to set the world house in order. Yes, the American woman, to every man's surprise, had won her industrial spurs.
So typically, the work life of the woman was seen as happening in the home. And World War II changed all of that.
That's where Rosie the Riveter happened, because the men went off to war, the women went to the factories.
Chicago women found work building ships, too. The Chicago Bridge and Iron Company in Seneca, Illinois, just south of the city, was asked to build the LST, or Landing Ship Tank. The LST was an ocean-going vessel that carried troops, tanks, and other mechanized equipment right to the beach to support invasion of enemy-controlled territory in Europe and the Pacific.
They called it the Prairie Shipyard. And they built 157 of these LSTs and employed 10,000 people working literally 24/7, cranking out a ship every 4 days.
They would plop them into the Illinois River, float them to the Mississippi, take the Mississippi all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico and out into the war.
Chicago's legendary Pullman Railcar Company, the nation's premier maker of luxury train cars, would retool to make a variety of war materiel, including Sherman tanks, aircraft wings, mortar shells, sub-chasers, and mini LSTs.
There were 3 major shipbuilders in the Chicago area during World War II. One of them, Henry Greeby and Company, formerly the makers of luxury pleasure yachts, began repurposing their company to build minesweepers.
They actually built 25 motor minesweepers of 270 tons. Minesweepers are wooden-hulled boats because wooden hulls don't attract magnetic mines.
In addition to making ships, Chicagoans made a weapon to destroy ships. Theirs, not ours.
Another interesting example of how plants in the United States have converted to war. This plant was manufacturing tin cans that packed the nation's food. Now they make torpedoes.
The Amertorp Company was actually American Can Company. At the outbreak of World War II, cans were out, torpedoes were in. Albert Kahn, the Amertorp architect, he pioneered wide-span, open buildings that didn't have a lot of structural members.
Kahn started out building factories for the auto producers in Detroit. He is the expert in building these production plants, especially for war. So Amertorp was enormous. There were almost 10,000 workers, and they built 19,000 mostly aerial torpedoes.
Torpex is an explosive far more powerful than TNT. And there was enough in that factory to level a city block. I'm sure the neighbors didn't know.
There are actually 4 entities in Chicago that made aviation engines or airplanes. The Chrysler Dodge plant on the south side, that one was the granddaddy of them all.
And that's where they built sophisticated engines for the mighty B-29 Super Fortress. The Dodge Chicago plant, another Albert Kahn design, was the largest building in the world in 1944.
82 acres under roof, 30 square city blocks.
35,000 employees, 75% of whom were women, converted raw materials into more than 18,000 engines in record time.
The B-29 engines manufactured here would power the super fortresses that carried the atomic bombs to Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And those bombs were developed right here at the University of Chicago.
Not all 1,400 Chicago companies produced heavy equipment or deadly weapons.
For example, Kraft food, making special kind of food that would keep for a long time, that you could send a long distance.
We had Cracker Jack that were making powdered coffee for GI rations.
The Western Electric Hawthorne Works manufactured military electronics, including radar.
The Hammond Organ Company made caskets for the military.
Radio Flyer went from making toy wagons to making jerry cans, gas cans basically.
Libby Glass made plexiglass canopies for the Corsair.
Chicago Roller Skate Company produced ordnance.
The Victor Adding Machine Company made the super secret Norden bomb sight.
It's hard to imagine something that wasn't made in Chicago. And companies were not only happy to contribute to the war effort, but they made some money on it.
Not every company was as patriotic as one would hope. There was corruption, war profiteering.
There was also exploitation. Child labor laws were being suspended, relaxed, or ignored, and Illinois was the worst offender. Filmed at a Chicago high school, this short reveals the growing relationship between children and the war machine.
Here are the potential war workers of today, the foundation of the victory, the work of our public schools. Young men and women must be made physically fit for action wherever our country needs them. Young men and women must be trained to build planes, ships, guns, tanks, to build them faster and better, to build against time. Every school has a vital part to play in the great war effort.
High school dropouts who worked in the factory out-earned their teachers, so there was less incentive to stay in school.
And if they couldn't work in the factory, children could work scrap drives, salvaging anything to help the war effort.
Completing Chicago's Every Citizen Must Help program are, God bless them, the kids. Banding together in one gigantic army of youth, the children set the example for their elders.
Everyone was involved. 5-year-old kids would save tinfoil and balls. 10-year-olds like me, they'd let us out of school for collections. And we'd go around and we'd get scrap metal, newspapers, tin cans full of bacon grease, which would be turned into ammunition. Everything could be used.
Hey, Sonny, I'll give you $100 for that tire. Guess he didn't hear me. Regular neighborhood salvage collections are a custom sight now in Chicago.
Another accustomed sight were Mayor Kelly's vigilant civil defense captains, who insisted on blackout drills to protect the city from unlikely enemy air attacks.
Block captains would come around during a blackout test and ring your bell and tell you, pull those shades down. Other guys, air raid wardens, who'd go up on the roofs, and they'd be looking for airplanes. I don't know what for. I know Messerschmitt Me-109 is going to get over here.
While enemy planes wouldn't be bombing Chicago, the sting of war was felt in other ways. An average of 7 to 8 Chicagoans from every block served in the military.
In almost every window was a white flag, a banner, with gold trim around the outside, and stars in the middle of it. Blue stars for someone who was serving, a gold star for someone who had been killed in the war. Some houses had 3 and 4 stars in them. Everyone had someone who was involved in the war.
We had a friend that spent time with our family. And D-Day Normandy, he was killed on a LST, and that was what suddenly woke me up, that it wasn't all just fanfare and drums and bugles.
I remember a boy in the neighborhood was killed in action. And the whole neighborhood, different ethnic groups, Polish, Greek, Armenian, the whole neighborhood went into a kind of mourning. He was a son for every family.
So yes, the war was very real to us. And what it was, in retrospect, was the time of the most unity and patriotism I've ever seen in this country. Nothing has matched it since. Because we knew the consequences could be we could lose. We could lose the war.
We thought that, there's a chance that the Germans were going to completely overrun Europe and then come here next. The Japanese were going to completely overrun the Pacific and then come here next. We were literally fighting for our lives.
To ensure the military had what they needed for victory, the rationing of everything from food to cigarettes to fuel would become a daily part of life here. Employing stamp books and a point system, the goal was to teach civilians to make do with less while still getting their fair share.
So here's a plan that's fair and square. Everybody gets their share. Share alike for victory. Get the point, Mrs. Brown.
Sugar rationing started in 1942 and gets much more Byzantine as they start adding stuff. One of the first things to go were car tires. And then gas was rationed. So if you were caught speeding, you lost your gas card. Shoes were rationed. You only got 2 pairs of shoes per year. The ration system was complicated. You start to think about what do people do to live with it, to maybe get around it.
People did a lot to get around it. Ration stamp books were stolen by the thousands and sold on the black market. And many felt the whole program was corrupt under the administration of Michael Mulcahy.
The Chicago Tribune railed fiercely against Mulcahy, branded as a tool of the Kelly machine. There were complaints that favored politicians in Chicago were getting an unfair ration of what they needed.
But by the war's end, it was generally agreed the rationing program had succeeded. And so had food gardens for defense, later known as victory gardens.
Chicago, the hub of America. There are 200,000 amateur farmers. Their farms are not large, but their hearts are full of it. These are victory gardens, gardens for war.
And it was a social event. When the dads got home at night, we gathered there by your victory garden and talked about your corn and your carrots and your kohlrabis and the other things.
The pressure to work, to sacrifice, to produce was overwhelming. And civilians needed rest and relaxation. Chicagoans loved sports. And the dominant sports during the war were college football, horse racing, and of course, baseball.
Baseball was sort of going through hard times with players being drafted. The teams were so poverty-stricken that they made the fans throw the balls back. So on the south side, you had the Chicago White Sox. Not a splendid nine by any stretch of the imagination, but they had a wonderful shortstop named Luke Appling, whose nickname was Old Aches and Pains, and Luke was always complaining about his old aches and pains. On the north side, at Wrigley Field, the Cubs at the outset of the war didn't look like they were going to be any better. They had Bill Swish Nicholson, swish because that was the sound his bat made every time he struck out.
But in 1943, with more and more players being drafted, and some minor leagues folding, President Roosevelt considered suspending Major League Baseball. One team owner was prepared.
You may remember it from a movie called A League of Their Own. P.K. Wrigley, the owner of the Cubs, had a great idea called the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. It was a league that was built around small towns, Dixon, Kankakee, Rockford, home of the Rockford Peaches.
Wrigley, seen here from behind, wasn't just looking for good ball players. He needed personalities who could attract paying fans.
Let's talk about football for a minute. The Bears were sort of blessed. They still had an abundance of great players. Bulldog Turner, Bronco Nagurski, legendary names, the most famous of which was Sid Luckman, who was the first great T formation quarterback.
Luckman.
In addition to sports teams, Chicago had plenty of movie theaters and attendance was high. But by far the most popular source of entertainment was radio.
And it was radio that brought the country together as one on the home front. Now, you know, Chicago radio was heard from coast to coast. We heard Don McNeil and his Breakfast Club.
From Chicago, it's Don McNeil's Breakfast Club.
Say, winter came back to roost yesterday for a little while.
Radio, I remember as a kid listening to my programs in the afternoon, Jack Armstrong.
Jack Armstrong, the all-American boy.
And Captain Midnight.
Excitement, mystery, suspense, thrills galore for red-blooded young Americans.
And at 6 o'clock, the radio was no longer my property. It belonged to the older folks because they wanted to listen to the latest news reports.
Hello, America. This is Edward Murrow speaking from London. There were more German planes over the coast of Britain today.
Chicagoland was home to multiple military training centers, and thousands of servicemen passed through the city every day, young men and women looking for a good time. Mayor Kelly was determined to keep their morale high.
Ed Kelly decided that Chicago was going to be the most servicemen and women friendly city in the world. They had the best USOs, they had free transportation, free hotel.
12 stories of free food, recreation, and entertainment. Not 1 cent can the serviceman spend here. Presiding over the edibles is Mrs. Kelly, and Mrs. Kelly keeps plenty busy passing out the cake.
To improve the lifestyle of its trainees, the military took an 18-acre piece of lakefront and turned it into a servicemen's club. And it was staffed by many, many very attractive young ladies. And they would host these sailors and Marines and take them through all of these activities and go dancing with them at night.
For some, Kelly's Servicemen's Center and the Navy's Country Club by the lake wouldn't be enough. They were going to war and might not be returning.
Say, where does a guy find some sport in this town?
Organized crime in Chicago, known as the Outfit, was deeply involved in prostitution and gambling. Prostitution was run in and out of hotels in downtown Chicago. These young men had to be entertained, and the mob was standing right by to provide them with girls. Attractive young women who would solicit men for drinks, and they would encourage the patron to go upstairs to where the real action was.
There was action on Lake Michigan, too. Pilots from Naval Air Station Glenview did their carrier qualification just off the Chicago shoreline.
Naval Air Cadets, 1,000 miles from the sea, take off for their floating base of operations on one of America's Great Lakes. Formerly the world's biggest side-wheel passenger steamer, she's now the training carrier Wolverine. An inland carrier training 10,000 new Navy fighter pilots a year.
Each night, the two lake carriers, Wolverine and Sable, were docked at Chicago's Navy Pier.
That was not Navy Pier's only purpose during World War II. It was the Naval Air Technical Training Center, and we trained over 60,000 maintenance crews in engine maintenance and airframe maintenance and avionics maintenance and all of the different skills necessary to maintain and repair aircraft in the fleet.
By far the biggest naval training center was at Great Lakes, a boot camp north of the city, responsible for training 1/3 of all Navy personnel serving in the war. Like all training centers and the entire military, Great Lakes was segregated. But it was there that a change in thinking about minorities in leadership roles occurred.
The Golden 13 were the first African-American commissioned naval officers in U.S. Navy history. It was 22 hand-selected sailors who were already in the Navy, whittled down to 13, who went through this rigorous training program. They were pioneers. They broke down racial barriers, and their legacy can be seen today. I've been an officer in the United States Navy for over 20 years.
Aircraft carriers weren't the only vessels on Lake Michigan supporting the war effort.
The war demanded huge, massive amounts of steel. So we had the ore boats carrying iron ore from the Minnesota region, self-unloaders carrying stone from northern Michigan, and coal boats loaded at Lake Erie and brought to South Chicago. And what was really critical was keeping the lakes open during the winter months.
Through the frozen Great Lakes, the new United States Coast Guard icebreaker Mackinac cuts a vital path. Behind her, cargo vessels en route from Duluth to Chicago in the earliest midwinter crossing on record.
So this sculpture here marks the location of the first self-sustained nuclear reaction.
Almost hate to mention it. University of Chicago could be the birthplace of the end of everything, the start of the nuclear age.
In 1939, German-born Jewish physicist Albert Einstein penned a letter to President Roosevelt, warning him about our enemy's potential development of extremely powerful bombs of a new type. Roosevelt took him seriously, and the top-secret Manhattan Project was born, involving multiple facilities around the country, including the University of Chicago.
The Manhattan Project was the project to produce the atomic bomb. It had nothing to do with Manhattan. That was just the name of the thing.
The role of the University of Chicago was to produce a self-sustaining chain reaction in a nuclear reactor called a pile.
Heading the Chicago team that would achieve the chain reaction was Italian physicist Enrico Fermi.
Enrico Fermi fled Europe because his wife was Jewish, and he wins the Nobel Prize, packs up the trunk, and then gets to Chicago.
4 major academic buildings were appropriated for the Manhattan Project. There were guards and a facility called the Metallurgical Laboratory. It was a cover to hide uranium research.
It was all very cloak and dagger. There was a military transport plane out at Midway Airport. It was used to shuttle Fermi and his team back and forth to meetings. Briefcases handcuffed to their wrists.
By late 1942, Fermi was ready. Conducting his experiment under the university's Stag football field, the idea was to bombard uranium with neutron particles, splitting the atoms, releasing more neutrons until a chain reaction released unprecedented amounts of energy.
Just in case something went wrong, there was a suicide squad that would dump a cadmium solution over the whole pile. It would turn everything off.
On December 2nd, as Fermi had calculated, the uranium pile went critical, and the world's first self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction was achieved.
The Nazi government was working on the same project. We had to beat them.
Fermi's chain reaction was weaponized, resulting in atomic bombs powerful enough to decimate the Japanese cities Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The bombs were delivered by B-29s, with engines manufactured in Chicago. Beloved President Franklin Delano Roosevelt died April 12, 1945, just weeks before victory in Europe. His successor, President Harry Truman, would force the surrender of Japan just months later, on September 2nd.
The man who lived across the street from us came out of his house, running down the steps. "The war is over," he said. "The war is over." And pretty soon, everybody in the neighborhood was coming out of their house, and they were on the street, and they were screaming and yelling.
If the war did anything for our neighborhood, it unified us. It broke down ethnic barriers because we were all in this together.
You think about people going to war, about young men, about young women. We rarely think about entire cities going to war, which is what happened in Chicago.
30 minutes after the cessation of hostilities on VJ Day, 30 minutes after it was announced, not a single machine was turning.
What now for all the workers? The end of the war was both a relief and a concern.
Some women felt relieved to return to kind of a more traditional nuclear family, a more traditional home life. But others missed that kind of freedom that comes from earning your own paycheck.
The post-war depression that everybody expected never came. And Chicago greatly benefited from the amount of money spent on war contracts here.
Throughout the history of this country, part of the economy is based on the manufacture of weapons and things that are related to war.
America got an awareness of its own strength. The ability to manufacture was like an endless supply line. But I think it was the nascent beginning of becoming a superpower.
When Mayor Ed Kelly died in 1950, only naive Chicagoans wondered about the considerable wealth he'd accumulated during 14 years in office. But most would agree he'd been an effective wartime mayor.
He played a huge role in World War II, not only because of his influence on Roosevelt and his ability to get Roosevelt elected for a third term, but also he was head of civil defense for the entire Midwest region. So when Chicago went to war, he was up to the task.
World War II was the deadliest conflict in history. Casualty estimates total over 60 million, climbing to 80 million from war-related disease and famine. The world had paid a terrible price.
Beyond the veneration for country, beyond the loyalty to country, there is a loyalty we have to mankind, to the earth, which is country to all of us.
Modern American warfare is primarily experienced by those doing the fighting and their families, with the general public often unaffected, even disinterested. That was not the case during World War II.
Chicago produced not only the materiel for the war effort, tanks and machines, Chicago produced personnel. Chicago produced men and women who won the war.
Today, there are reminders of Chicagoland's wartime history everywhere, some more visible than others. But perhaps the most ominous reminder of a war everyone hoped would be the last is buried in a Southside forest preserve. Radioactive material from the Manhattan Project lies beneath this marker.